That was such a nice introduction. Thank you. It's going to seem redundant when I talk about Henry Cavill here in a minute, but that's good. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I was telling some people earlier, I used to actually be the welfare tutor for Goodrich, so this is really a homecoming to my university and my home here in Hes East. So I'm going to talk today about the history of game studies, which some people may find boring, but I think academics find it interesting, or at least I do, so here we are. I was told the theme was research innovation. So we're going to look at research innovation in game studies from the time I was in York and even a little bit before to where we are now, and how our research field has changed both science and society for the better. Ding. Wrong way. Okay. So here's a little overview of today's talk. I'm going to introduce myself, although Sebastian did a great job of that. We're going to take a small trip down memory lane. We're going to look at game studies through the years, and then we're going to end the note on some research innovation wins. So who am I? I'm Rachel, and that's my office at home. I'm the research director of Take This, which is a mental health nonprofit that serves the gaming industry and gaming communities. We kind of beautifully bridge that gap between advocating for people in the industry and providing mental health information and resources for members of the community. I know a lot of you are familiar with Safe in Our World. That's kind of our UK sister organization. I am also a science content creator on YouTube, iGGi, where I regularly end with the Bill and Ted phrase, so I appreciate that kind of tie-in. And also I put Cavill Influencer on there, honestly, because I guess it's my brand. And last time I didn't do it, I got called out, so there we are. I know that this looks really good on a slide, and when I made this slide, I was like, oh, it's so nice and concise. But getting here has been a really long journey. And while my research journey really flourished at the University of York, it started a few years earlier when I was getting my master's degree at Santa Clara University. The top picture is my graduation day at Santa Clara with my celebratory Starbucks, because I've always been wild. And the bottom picture is my first day at York when I was looking for the psych department. And if you know campus, you will know I was lost. But that sign is really great. So when I was doing my master's in 2008 is when I first realized game studies could be a thing. So I was studying to become a therapist, and this was peak World of Warcraft. So I was seeing parent after parent coming to me saying, my kids are playing World of Warcraft, I'm really concerned. Are they going to be socially inept? Is it going to make them aggressive or violent? And when I looked for research in the field, there was 1 or 2 papers from Nikki from Stanford, and that was it. And after, the dozen set of parents who came in, I was concerned about myself because I played loads of World of Warcraft, and I was like, shoot, is this a problem? They seem really concerned. So there wasn't any work. I applied for a PhD at the University of York, and I remember doing my interview very clearly, and I applied with the idea of looking at video games and adaptive functioning. So how do games impact us physically, socially, and psychologically, which is obviously too big of a question. It became much more narrow. But I remember in the interview, kept saying, we need this information, we need to know how games impact us, we just need to know. And there was a pause, and at the end of the interview, someone said, not my supervisor, but someone on the committee, why? The worst question, right? Why? Who needs this information? You keep saying people need it, but who needs it? And I was like, well, the clinicians need it. And there was a pause, and then he was like, good answer. Oh, thank God. So I think I got the placement for that one answer. But the reason I tell that story is because I think it really highlights that nobody understood games as being important, interesting, worth our time. Why are we researching it? Who needs it? What's it matter? And thankfully, we've come a long way from there. So when I started my work here in 2008, I was the only one that I knew of on campus anyway that was studying games. I was in the psychology department. It's a very traditional psychology department. I have one of my cohorts here, which makes me feel very nostalgic. And they do a lot of lexical learning and neuroscience and that sort of thing. And it was always kind of like, that's the girl that plays a lot of World of Warcraft. And it was all kind of strange, but it's great to see all you guys here and how it's developed. So technically, game studies started in the 1970s. That's when people started showing an interest in what games are and what they could be, but it had a major resurgence in the early 2000s, which is when I came on the scene, and this is when it has really kind of propelled into what it is today. So I thought I'd take most of the time today taking a look back at the history of game studies and highlighting the different research innovations to show how we've grown and where we've come since the beginning. So to be clear, these kind of eras don't really have end dates. They all kind of persist through time and they build upon each other, but I just kind of put dates here to kind of differentiate when they started coming to the forefront. So as I mentioned, it started in the 1970s, which I have dubbed the universal years, which is when people started to become very concerned about what was happening in arcades, because it couldn't be people having fun. Obviously, it had to be something bad, right? So I lovingly refer this as to the universal years because the idea was that everything happening was universal, universally bad, of course. The way that these machines were impacting people, no matter who you were, what you were doing, what you were playing, was universally bad. And this was a very media in, content in, behavior out type research paradigm. So I did a bit of digging, and the earliest research piece I could find was from 1978, which is actually a doctoral dissertation called Selected Physiological Measure of Arousal in High and Low Trait Anxiety Females During Competition. And there's their sweet lab. We've come a long way. Another example comes from Senlo, which is work you might be more familiar with, which is from 1986, I believe, about electronic friend. And this paper was about how arcade machines could be replacing our real-world friendships. Now again, it wasn't about the social relationships in the arcade, it was about the machine and how the machine was becoming an electronic friend. Now a lot of this interest in this time as well, not only being media in, content out, it was due to the idea that games were dynamic and games were universal and they were somehow more than the traditional media that we were interacting with. And that was kind of the primary research innovation of the time, looking at games as something more than when it comes to media. So you see here under the title are kind of like the main points of the era, and then I have the main research innovation on the side, and all the slides will be like that. So these discussions of universality grew into some discussions of content. We started talking about Death Race, right? Death Race was kind of the first moral panic game where you play a little car and you run over people, and they called it a murder simulator, and that was of course universally bad for everyone and affected all players equally. So the start of this year, the start of the universal years was really the development and when development of theories changed to try to understand dynamic media, to try to understand what is going on when a player engages in a space and the space responds to what they are doing. Now I attribute these years to the 70s, 80s, and 90s because during this time the focus was very much on content and very much focused on the bad and assuming the bad was universal. So that takes us to the early 2000s, which is when game studies started to reemerge as a research field. So as I mentioned, when I was at Santa Clara in 2008, there were a couple studies from Stanford, but we were soon to see that this was going to be a major resurgence in game studies, and I think this is largely due to the rise of the MMORPG. Lest we forget how incredibly popular World of Warcraft was. This is showing monthly subscribers. In 2008, there were 10.9 million monthly subscribers, and I want that paycheck because that is incredible. And in 2013, when World of Warcraft was even on the decline, and there were much more graphically pleasing, kind of cutting-edge games, they still had 7 million monthly subscribers. Now, the popularity of MMOs reinvigorated the moral panic about games, but it also led to a resurgence of academic interest in games. So this is when it really started to take off. Now we may have hyper-focused a little bit on MMOs, and we may still see that today, but we did also start to move away from this idea of universal impact. And we started to understand that games are dynamic spaces and players are dynamic consumers. So during this time, we saw a rise in motivational models, for instance, the work of Yi, which of course built on the work of Richard Bartle, who sadly couldn't be here today. But it was in the 2000s that they really all kind of converged, and we started to see a study in different aspects of games, different motivations of games, different kinds of players in games. So the other thing I want to point out in the MMORPG years is that it coincided with the rise of social media, which means we started to see snowball sampling. So our sample sizes were starting to get bigger. We still see snowball sampling when our budget is very low and we still need people to fill out our surveys. And I point that out here because sampling changed a lot through the years as we go on through this talk. Now the work here was still very much validity of the bad, aggression, addiction, antisocial. But we were seeing a lot of growth. So we started at 2000, around 2010. This comes from Paul Martin. You see around 2010, the amount of publishing in video game research had steeply started to increase. Now at this time, we also started to see another shift, which is sampling. Specifically in regards to who we considered were players, who we considered were our core audience. I call this era the player years because we started now to shift away a bit from MMORPGs as being like the exemplar population and towards discussions of representative samples and what I like to call non-gamer but player samples. We're starting to figure out that we need to start to think a bit more broadly in a global and community context and not just the niche corners of World of Warcraft. If you can call it niche, it was very popular. So this is when we realized it wasn't just Eddie, although we love him, who played games, but it was also Henry, of course. You had to get one. You had to get one. But also my cute kids, right? And my mom. That's my mom playing Pac-Man at the arcade. So this shift in our broadening scope of samples was brought on by the fact that in 2010, the games industry had grown beyond, arcades. It had grown beyond MMOs. It had grown incredibly. This shows video game sales 2000 to 2015. The video game retail sales in the US was 8.2 billion in 2000. In 2010, it was 19.2 billion. So the growth had gone beyond arcade players, beyond World of Warcraft players. We were starting to see more kind of mainstream casual games. We were starting to see Rock Band and Bejeweled, and it wasn't just about the stereotype of the kid in the basement. It was about, oh, I'm going to my friend's house to play Rock Band before I go out and have a night out. The not gamer, but player crowds. And our research was starting to reflect that. So this research shift happened partially because we already had a strong foundation. 2000 to 2010, we saw a strong growth in the amount of work that was being done, but also we had changed our understanding of what games are and our understanding of who's playing them and what gamers are. So in these so-called player years, we started to see a real emphasis on non-traditional samples. But the other really big shift was we were starting to look at the good in games rather than just discrediting the bad. Which makes sense, because if we expand our idea of what games are, if we expand our idea of what context they're being played in, it only makes sense. We would expand our idea of what impact that games are having. So here's just one example. In the 2010s, we started to see a lot more discussion about games in education, for instance. So how games can be used in the classroom in a purposeful way. Or also how games can facilitate what I like to call unintentional learning. So learning things from a game even though you weren't intending to learn them, like history from playing Civilization. And we also started to look at positive psychological outcomes. So here's just one example, looking at flourishing mental health. I never thought I'd live to see the day we'd see a title, Flourishing Mental Health and Games Together, right? It's a far different narrative than games are ruining a generation. So around 2015, game studies took a bit of a dramatic turn, perhaps the most dramatic turn since the MMORPG years. Around 2015, we saw a lot of growth in the development and refinement of games as a research field. This development was both in terms of the way we're conducting research, but also where we were conducting research, which is why I called it the development years. All about expansion and refinement. So during this time, we started to see an increase in the rise of experimental work. For instance, we were starting to see social science labs built in around measuring games. We started to see these studies about physical experience of games, eye tracking, heart rate, sweat, those sorts of things, and a real focus on the immediate experience. So it's like, what is it like if I go into a lab and play Grand Theft Auto for 15 minutes? What am I going to experience versus what's happening over a lifetime of playing games? Now, the other expansion was a steep rise in UX. So we became way more employable, which was excellent. We see this chart, which is the rise of UX professionals, and around 2015, it just shot up exponentially. The game industry became very interested in tapping into our knowledge as a research community about the short-term effects of games, from a consumer perspective, engagement kind of became the buzzword of interest for the games industry. Now, along with the expansion did come a refinement of game studies as a research field. So we had, 15 years of knowledge to draw upon, and it showed in the way that our work was progressing. So I love this picture, I'm sorry. We went from this to this in 15 years, right? So we went from games prime violence, which is what we have on the right, to understanding that when Rachel breaks her mice playing first-person shooters, it's not because she's violent, she's just frustrated, she's got social pressures, and her hand-eye coordination never improved with organized sports. And, the therapist said it would, and it did not. Game studies had developed as a scientific discipline, and we incorporated all of the research innovations of the eras that came before. So one example is this work from Linda Kay, who's here somewhere in the audience. But it's a perfect example of this kind of refinement, the relationships between the structural video game characteristics, video game engagement, and happiness among individuals who play games. So this study wasn't just looking at engagement, which was the hot topic of these years, but also incorporating what we've learned in previous eras, the structural characteristics of games from the machine era, engagement, what we have here in the development era, happiness, looking at a positive outcome, right, instead of just trying to validate the bad. And we were starting to see far more complex work like this come out of research labs across the globe, considering short and long term, positive and negative, individual and group differences. Which takes us to today, which are the 2020s, which I like to call the hybrid years. It builds on all the research innovations of the past, and I feel like we've entered this mythical space where the industry and academy are working together, which is great. The key characteristic we're seeing now is this integration of subjective and objective data, which doesn't necessarily mean you're working directly with the industry, but we are starting to see that happen more often. I gave a whole talk about it, about GDC. I saw Nick's poster outside. He was talking about it in his work as well. We're seeing Riot work with the Fair Play Alliance. We're seeing the ESA work with Oxford Internet Institute. There's things like Borderlands Science, which if you're not familiar with Borderlands Science, you should Google it. It's a really cool initiative that's happening inside of Borderlands. So speaking to the hybrid nature of today's work, there's also growing interest in game-adjacent spaces. It's not just about the machine and behavior route, it's also about what's happening on Twitch, what's happening on Discord, what about gamer social identity that we take out into the world when we're not playing games? How do all of these things impact us short and long term? And generally speaking, I think we're seeing much more of a lean away from the negative and towards the positive. And I think if you've looked at the posters out there, you'd agree there's a lot more leaning towards the positive, which is great. So here's an example of the hybrid work, which is the OII work, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's from 2021. The researchers worked with Nintendo of America and Electronic Arts, and they utilized server play data in combination with self-report data to look at the relationship between games and well-being over time. And it is an excellent, excellent piece of work. Now, this singular paper, powered by the collaboration of industry and academy, did more to rebuke this narrative about games being bad for our mental health than the 10 years that came before it. I mean, it really did. And because it got, first of all, it got so much press. It got so much press. Amazing. And I think it did because of the power of the industry collaborating with academy. It wasn't the games industry being like, we did proprietary work and games are great. It was really the power of the collaboration. I never thought, again, I would see headlines with such positive words about games. So this is becoming more popular. There's some work coming out of York, even, looking at 118 billion hours of data, which I would love and hate to work on that project. There's also this work that I just published with the ADL looking at Minecraft. We got data, we looked at 2 million chat log data from Minecraft servers. We worked together with ADL and Middlebury to sift through that. So research innovation, we've grown a lot as a research field in terms of how many we are, first of all, but also in terms of where we've positioned ourselves in various academic departments, in the industry, in nonprofits, especially coming from our very first studies from the universal years. And as a research field, we have continually pushed forward and grown and innovated, and our persistence and mere existence as a research field has been good for both science and society. And if you're asking why, or how, not why, if you're asking how, I will tell you. I want to leave highlighting some of our research innovation wins for game studies as a research field. The first being that we're growing. We are everywhere, which is awesome. I host a repository of game studies, places you can go for graduate school for game studies on my own personal website, and my own list has over 160 programs, and that doesn't even count game design programs. Not only are we growing, we are foundational in a wide variety of fields: psychology, sociology, computer science, game studies as itself is a field, as iGGi can attest to. And the video games industry, as I mentioned before, there are also numerous UX departments. Social scientists are being hired all over the globe to optimize game design. There's also the mental health component, understanding the uses and effects of games when it comes to games as coping tools, when it comes to games as maladaptive coping tools, when it comes to geek and gamer therapy. Medical fields, even, Endeavor RX was the first FDA-approved video game. It was approved a couple years ago now as an intervention for ADHD. And game studies can even be found in public health. This is kind of an old study, but they looked in World of Warcraft, looking at the corrupted blood debuff, and they were able to study how people would interact in a pandemic. It came very helpful when COVID came out. This study came back into the limelight. It's really fascinating. They found the younger players, which represent older people, would flee from the big cities. The druids and the priests, the doctors and the nurses, would come into the main cities, and they would try to heal and try to keep people from dying in the cities. Now, fun fact, the PI on this study was in my World of Warcraft guild, because life is funny and world is small. It's funny, huh? So the growth of game studies as a research field in scope and sophistication has also meant that we no longer have to belabor the point of why games, which is something I've been mentioning to several people already since I've been here. This is the second benefit we brought to science. So these are pictures from 2015, which is the last in-person keynote I gave. And it was a game studies conference, and I even opened that with games are important because. And today, justifying what we do and why we do it is important. We all have the one line in the start of our publication, but we don't have to belabor it. We don't have to say billions of people play them, and it's a billion-dollar industry, and they connect us. And game addiction is recognized by the World Health Organization, which, if you watch my YouTube, you know how I feel. But if nothing else, it brought that conversation to the forefront of why it's important to talk about games and study games. And as Sebastian mentioned, the United Nations and the Department of Homeland Security in the last year both have had roundtables specifically about games. So people are understanding that games are important, and we don't have to justify ourselves as much. So that's science. Talk about society for a minute. Some of you may say our work hasn't had much impact on society because when bad things happen, we see the same headlines, and it drives me batty and to Twitter. We all want easy solutions to complex problems. I don't think our work is going to change that, but what our work can change and has changed is the counter narrative that we see about games. We have a strong counter narrative that games are fun and they're important and they're things that we can do together and they're good for our mental health and we're not all in the basement, right? This certainly was not there in the early 2000s, and it would not be here if it weren't for all of the work that you do. It really would. The designers who came before you, the researchers who came before you, all you in this room. And this kind of news coverage it's changing the way that we all think about games. It's changing the way my mom thinks about games. My mom plays Wordle every day. I'm like, you're a gamer. And she's like, no. And I'm like, oh, come on, Mom. It's a good thing now. And I think we'll continue to see this counter-narrative grow as we continue through the hybrid years and whatever is next. So I want to thank you all for coming down this trip with Memory Lane with me. Talking about the history of game studies is something that I thought maybe only this crowd would find interesting. I saw this tweet that says, academics be like, I'm so incredibly excited for blank, and it's literally the most boring thing you've heard in your entire life. And I was like, game studies, history. So, I mean, I'm glad that you guys find it fun. And thank you for having me.